You are listening to the Airline Selection Podcast, where we bring you insights to help you succeed at airline selections. This podcast is brought to you by Airline Selection Program. Please welcome your host, airline captain and major airline recruiter, Guillaume Debauchez.
Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Airline Selection Podcast, where we bring you insights into airline selections and also from our guests. And today, again, we have Calvin Shields with us on a new episode of the Calvin Speaks series. Calvin, how are you doing today?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Guillaume. It's a lovely sunny day here today, and I'm feeling quite chipper, as we say in English.
Quite chipper. What does that mean?
That means happy. And,
Happy.
Okay. Chipper. Chipper means a good mood.
Good mood. Okay, well, let's bring that into our episode today. So what are we going to talk about today, Calvin?
Okay, I think the idea today is to talk about career paths compared with when I started and perhaps how it is today. But in order to discuss career paths, it's also necessary to consider the transportation in general in the UK in the 1960s and the 1970s. Great Britain was effectively broke after the Second World War. And it wasn't really until the early 60s that the economy started to grow. And times were hard and not many people could afford the luxury of a holiday. Aircraft at the time, I guess, were uneconomical and were regarded as unsafe, uncomfortable, and tickets were very expensive. So in many ways, only royalty, the military, the rich, and the film stars could afford to fly. I must say that my first 5 years on the VC-10, we'll talk about my career at another time, I would only really ever fly film stars, people who were very wealthy and occasionally royalty. But often you would get government personnel and military and so on who were on the aircraft, but very few holidaymakers. It was really exclusive for necessary travel, if you like. At the time, long distance travel was overwhelmingly by ship for most people in the UK. And right up to, I guess, the early 70s, you could get a ticket across the Atlantic on a regular basis on an ocean liner. At the same time, in the UK, there were very few airlines, and most were very small. BOAC and BEA, British Overseas Airways Corporation, and British European Airways were the two national airlines. BOAC was the long-haul operation, and BEA was the short-haul operations. They dominated the market. There were other airlines, much smaller airlines in the UK at the time. British United was one, Caledonian, Northeast was another one. There was Eagle Airways and Dan Air. They were the main players. When I joined British Airways, or BOAC, I beg your pardon, in the 60s, we had just two aircraft types. We had 15 Boeing 707s and 29 Vickers VC-10s. That's a total of 44 aircraft. Today, BA has a total of nearly 300 aircraft. And actually, when I was with BA, we had 57 747s at one point. So it shows the difference in scale. Therefore, at the time, the requirement for pilots was very low. And the demand was met by wartime pilots. Of course, if you can imagine in the early 40s, the ages of the pilots were in their early 20s. By the time the 60s came along, they were in their 40s. But there was a bit of a problem because in BOAC and BEA, the retirement age was 50 years old. So all would have retired. Basically, all the wartime pilots would probably retired by 1970. So BEA and BOAC decided to set up the college of air training, which we've already talked about, in 1960. That's when it actually opened to cover the retirement of the wartime pilots. Also, at the same time, the economy in the UK improved in the 60s, and that meant that there was a bit more demand for air travel. And so by the time I was at Hamble, we were running 4 courses a year, 4 courses of 48 people per year. Now, at the time, the career courses, the only way what I should say is British United and Caledonian also ran cadet schemes at Carlisle and Oxford, another 2 flying schools, if you like it, one in Scotland and one in England. So the only way to actually get a job at the time was to be a cadet with one of these cadet schemes or from the Air Force. There were very, very, very few privately funded direct entry pilots. Also, at the same time, it was generally assumed that once you were employed by the airline, it was a job for life. It's certainly the case for me. As I started training at BA at 18. I had to retire at 55 from BA, so I was in it for the whole of my career. But once again, it was subject to supply and demand. If the economic picture changed, there's a lot of inertia in that, and it's very difficult to predict ahead of time whether you actually need a number of pilots. So it was always easier to try and train more pilots than you really needed. So the actual number of pilots going through the cadet schools was very much subject to supply and demand. And I can think of many pilots who I believe were unnecessarily failed at Hamble because they suddenly decided they didn't need so many pilots. Also, pilots were failed later on in their early conversion courses. In BOAC, it was certainly the case. The other thing that happened is in the early 70s, Freddie Laker, you may have heard of Freddie Laker, he set up the very first no-frill bucket shop, as it was called at the time, Airline, which was offering low prices, which attracted many passengers. What he would actually do is he would contact travel agents and say, look, if you fill this airplane, you find 300 passengers on my DC-10, I can give you a very low price for everyone and you'll earn a handsome commission at the same time. And it worked really well. He also, he basically didn't give the first class travel. It was a no-frills airline, and it really did change the airline industry. And of course, BA had to, or BOAC and BEA had to respond by increasing aircraft numbers, and therefore more pilots were needed. So I suppose the career path for me as a young man was that there are very few airlines, therefore very little choice. But today it's very different. Many aspiring pilots actually pay for their own courses and are then confronted with the daunting task of finding a job.
Yes, Calvin, I would agree with you. Airlines are never perfectly staffed. They either have too many pilots or not enough. But that's just business, right? And that's something that it's very difficult for an aspiring pilot to understand and anticipate, because you set your eyes on an airline that you want to join. If it's a major airline, you want to join it eagerly. It will define your life if you get in and you put all your energy and effort, sometimes for a year or more, in order to prepare. And then you are subject to internal or external circumstances which you have no control over, and that could reduce your chances significantly. As you know, this is what happened to me, at least in part, because Air Liberté, the second airline in France, went bankrupt the week of my Air France selection. None of us got hired. Okay, and I prepared for a full year. I mean, I went to attend the shareholders assembly, in Paris, and I'd done so much work for this selection. I made a minor mistake at the group interview as well, and probably this little mistake, because the bar was higher on that week, got me to not be selected. So this is something that you have to understand. And actually, Air France was very kind because they debriefed me. Very few airlines do that. It shows how much they care for their pilots, actually. And he said, well, actually, you did a really good selection. You have to understand that we're not a government office to recruit pilots. We're an airline with constraints. And I was like, thank you for telling me that, because I can sleep at night now. I will be able to sleep tonight and know that he said, yeah, you should continue. You should persevere, So that really helped me. And then, as you know, a year and a half later, I was successful at BA. So he gave me a lot of energy. And there's a video on that subject called "Is the Game Rigged?" on our YouTube channel that I invite you to watch. So the only thing that you can control really is yourself. You can just try and be at your best and prepare at your best. And that's actually why we are here, okay? What to say? When I was in the recruitment department of Emirates, our manager would often come to us and show us the figures, the expectations, and they had very precise models. They knew something called the attrition rate. They knew how many people would leave from retirement. They also knew how many people would leave just because they would leave. They had a statistical model for that, which at major airlines doesn't happen that often, but at an airline like Emirates, it does happen and is factored in. And so they knew that, okay, well, we need X amount of pilots this year. If we need, say, 300 pilots this year or 400 pilots this year, we need to interview 4 times that because of the failure rate, because some people will pass and not come. So they've got this whole model. And even despite that, they will get it wrong. And sometimes an incident happens inside the airline. So like we said, an external circumstance, like an airline going bust, that means that they have to recruit all of these, and then they get a call from the Ministry of Transport saying, well, you have to interview these people as a priority. Could happen. Or an internal incident, which happened during my time in recruitment, where something happened on a flight, and that got all of a sudden the management to become quite tight on looking at where this came from. Was it a training error or was it a recruitment mistake? So they froze recruitment. They didn't freeze it. The bar became very high for a month. So if you are inside that month, unfortunately, you're going to have a tough selection. So another reason why to prepare, it's not only so that you can score at the highest and get through, it's also so that you can debrief yourself in case you're not getting a debriefing. If you know the rules of the game, you will probably understand if you did well or not. Something I hear about a lot is candidates who fail, they get a letter, and then afterwards they get a meet us. They go like, I have no idea what they were on about during the interview. They were turning around something, they were beating around the bush. I have no idea what the bush was about. This is a terrible feeling because it's tough to build on that. Okay, so over to you, Calvin. Sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say that if you fail the interview and you don't know why, you've just mentioned it, then it is a downward spiral, because if you then go for another interview, you're feeling very low because you don't know why you failed in the first time. Therefore, you don't know what you have to improve on. And I believe statistically, if you fail a second interview, a lot of people actually quit completely after that. So I think what you offer is actually very, very useful indeed, to feedback from your course so that you understand why you might have failed, or what your weaknesses are, I should say, really, what your weaknesses are, so that you can actually therefore work on those too. And what it will also do, it will improve your self-confidence. And self-confidence in interviews is pretty important. But of course, during my time, there was very little understanding of interview techniques, not only from the applicants, but also from the recruiters themselves. But that has changed dramatically now.
Yes, indeed. And you were part of the Singapore Airlines recruitment team as well. So you recruited experienced captains. So it was a different type of interview. But at the end of the day, we're all looking for the same things, right? This is why our course actually it works for every airline, because even though we teach you how to do your specific research and how to give the airline you're going for also what they need, essentially all of them are looking for the same sound behaviors. A well-rounded pilot who is not going to create problems and who has sound behaviors. Would you say that is true?
Absolutely. I can give you an example, actually. I interviewed I think he was German, if I remember rightly. I believe that he was with had been with one of the major Middle Eastern airlines. He was very, very well qualified. However, he was very aggressive. And he was well qualified for the job in terms of his experience and so on. But I think from a personal point of view, the co-pilots would have been quite frightened by him. And although he met the requirements from the technical point of view, from the social point of view, I felt that he was not suitable, and so we didn't employ him. So yes, I think it's interview technique is incredibly important, something which really, as I say, in my time was not there. My time in SIA was a very different sort of interview technique, because we were employing effectively mostly captains, some first officers, but mostly captains who already had to have a minimum of 10,000 hours. So, the interview was very different from an ab initio co-pilot.
Yes, indeed, Calvin. And so all in all, the message here is that recruitment needs are never perfectly quantified, even with airlines who try to do their best with it. Recruitment has become more technical from a pure recruitment point of view, meaning that the more the airline, the larger the airline, the more means they have at their disposal to use proper tools to evaluate human performance. It's not just psychometrics, it's also the use of a personality questionnaire, of onboard in-house psychologists who are specialized in aviation. And you have to understand also that human performance is, to an extent, a science. It's very, very well documented. Countless PhDs have taken place, and human performance is very well understood. And so this is what you're being faced with when you arrive at an interview as a candidate. So it's very important that you understand this. And there's something I very often say in our marketing videos. This is a skill you need for life, okay? It's a skill that will help you your whole career. And Calvin mentioned before that it was a job for life, but in fact, he ended up leaving British Airways and had to attend a selection at Singapore Airlines and later at TNT, like we said in one of the first episodes. So, and inside British Airways, he had to interview to become a trainer and then I guess an examiner. So you are subject to interviews several times in your life. At Emirates, we had an interview to become a captain as well, which was probably the biggest milestone in our career, was to pass that interview. You were subject again to quite a lot of scrutiny. You had to go in front of the psychologist again. And so it's about knowing what they expect, to give it to them in a format that's easy for them to digest and ticks their boxes in a way where you understand the exercise and everybody's happy and you can get recruited. Once you understand that, it's, your career will look so much different if you pass all of your interviews compared that if you pass half of them, or say that you pass most of them. If you passed all the interviews in your career, you'll become a chief pilot. That's as simple as that. So your career could be significantly different. And I'm glad that you're saying that we bring something valuable. I think so too. And it's my mission that young pilots are not in this state of unknown as they exit flight school, because like you said, in your days, there were not that many possibilities to become a pilot. It was not known at all what was on the other side of the curtain. There was no preparation. In my days, there were some preparations, but they were very academic. Then they explained to you the exercises that you were expecting, but they didn't explain what was going on the other side of the curtain. And this is actually what creates anxiety in candidates, is what do they want? You're left guessing. And when you're left guessing, it creates anxiety. And this anxiety has a direct impact on your confidence. And confidence is one of the most important things for a pilot. Once you lose that, it's, like you said, a downward spiral that's very difficult to sort of recover from. So anyway, I hope that, do you have anything to add, Calvin?
Yeah, just a little thing. Obviously, people who fail ultimately do fail and maybe quit the industry. It's not the end of the world. And the people who failed at Hamble when I was there in my youth, some of them went on to become quite successful people in different areas. For example, one became a very well-known barrister. Another one became an admiral in the Royal Navy.
Oh, wow.
And another one became a very famous weather presenter for Sky TV. So what I would suggest, it's not the end of the world. If you do fail, don't give up and search for something else. You use the same tenacity to find something that actually you are very happy with and very good at.
I would say today, there are quite a lot of opportunities, particularly when we are recording this now. There are very many opportunities, and you have the opportunity to sit 1, 2, 3, 4 selections and to improve from the one to the other. As far as I'm concerned, if you've got a flying license, you're fit to fly a plane. Very few people will present issues that will repeatedly and without them being fixable prevent them from entering an airline. Most of you have what it takes, okay? And the large majority of you have what it takes. It's about framing yourself properly in order to bring something digestible to your recruiter. But like Calvin said, in his days, when he was at Hamble, some of his cadet course got failed unnecessarily just because the airline all of a sudden needed to have they had too many of them for a little while. This is very unfair. You have to be ready for that. You have to be resilient on that and carry on for a little bit more than 2 attempts, okay? Because, statistically, and that's the French DGAC statistic, out of all the pilots who have an ATPL, a frozen ATPL, only half of them renew their licenses after 3 years. Okay, so this tells me that roughly 25% of people pass a given selection. They try again. Maybe they try again a third time. And if they are still in this failing statistic, then that makes 50% of them that don't reapply. That is a bit of a shame. And I hope that gradually we can not only improve your and the general pilot population's capacity to sustain interviews, and also explain to the airlines how important it is that you do get that training, that you do get to understand airline operations better, to make a better impression on them. That's actually one of the main points of this podcast here, is with someone like Calvin to try and explain to you what is this job, what you face during your career, so that you can project yourself adequately and make a strong impression. I'd like to add one more thing. The strong impression, you need to make it if you're an experienced pilot, of course, someone who's got even a low hour qualified pilot. But as a cadet, you need to make that impression too, even though you don't have flight hours. You need to understand your job. And this is the point of this podcast today. Right. Calvin, do we have anything else to discuss today?
No, I think that's very thorough. All I would suggest is that my time was very different from today.
Yeah.
And you need to be prepared, as simple as that.
Indeed. Good. So I think we will close this episode now. It was a pleasure to have you on board, Calvin. And again, for more guidance and help you succeed at your interviews, you can continue to watch this podcast, go and see us on our YouTube channel, and otherwise check out our courses. We're here to help you succeed and have the career that you deserve.
This podcast was brought to you by Airline Selection Program, a company that is focused on helping you succeed at airline selections. Our flagship course, Advanced Interview Course, has helped hundreds of pilots just like you become successful. Visit our website at online.airlineselectionprogram.com and find out how you too can get the job of your dreams.